How does Wharton use the conflict between Mrs. Black and Mrs. Manstey to develop the theme of the text? In this lesson, you will learn how to identify the development of theme by analyzing conflict. But first, let's review. We've been doing a close reading of Mrs. Manstey's View by Edith Wharton. In this lesson, we will focus on the themes found in the text. A theme is the dominant idea that a writer is trying to convey to his or her readers in a work of literature. This is the meaning released by the work when we take all aspects of the work into account. Some common thematic words found in literature include immortality, lost love, pride, and empowerment. These thematic words can be expanded into messages about life, like the dangers and downfalls of pride, the quest for immortality, love lost and found, and the empowerment of women. When we look for a theme, we need to look across the text, so reviewing the plot diagram can be very helpful. There are three main parts to the plot diagram: the exposition or beginning, the climax, the most intense point in the development of the story, and the resolution, the ending. In the beginning, Mrs. Manstey is looking out of her window, admiring the view of the yards that belong to the upper class. The climax occurs when Mrs. Manstey sets fire to a wooden balcony attached to Mrs. Black's building. She does this because Mrs. Black doesn't care about Mrs. Manstey's concerns, and the construction of the addition, which would block Mrs. Manstey's view, has already begun. The story is resolved with the death of Mrs. Manstey. She dies because she got pneumonia when she went outside late at night to burn the wooden balcony, and she was only wearing a light nightgown. Then, after Mrs. Manstey dies, the construction of the addition continues. So now, when we're looking for how one or multiple themes develop within a text, there are three steps that we can follow. First, we're going to identify the conflict in the text. Then we're going to ask ourselves, how does the conflict cause the main character to change or affect other characters? And third, we're going to ask ourselves, what message does the author develop over the course of the text through this conflict? So the first thing we need to do is identify the conflict in the text. Let's look at the plot diagram again. On the plot diagram, the conflict occurs between the exposition and the climax because it is the conflict that drives the action towards the climax. We know that the conflict in Mrs. Manstey's view is the conversation between Mrs. Black and Mrs. Manstey because Mrs. Black's lack of concern towards Mrs. Manstey regarding the extension drove Mrs. Manstey to set the balcony on fire. Now that we've identified the conflict, we are ready to move on to the next step, which is to ask ourselves, how does the conflict cause the main character to change or affect other characters? Let's first look at the changes in Mrs. Manstey. I definitely see a change in her. She starts off as an introvert. She spends most of her time in her apartment looking out of her window. It isn't until Mrs. Simpson, Mrs. Manstey's landlady, comes to visit and tells Mrs. Manstey about Mrs. Black's extension that we see a change in our protagonist. At the end of the story, she commits arson to stop the construction. Going from an introvert to an arsonist is a big change. Now, the second half of the step asks us to think about how the main character affects other characters. Because the conflict deals with Mrs. Black and Mrs. Manstey, the question would be, how does the main character affect Mrs. Black? Mrs. Manstey doesn't have any effect on Mrs. Black. After Mrs. Manstey dies, Mrs. Black continues the construction. Both Mrs. Manstey's change and the fact that she has no impact on Mrs. Black are essential for identifying the theme. In fact, both of these point to two themes that interact with one another. So in order to verify that these themes develop across the text, I'm going to look at page 9, specifically the paragraph when Mrs. Manstey leaves her room at night to commit arson. By focusing on this page, I will be addressing the third step, which is to ask, what message does the author develop over the course of the text through this conflict? Here's the text. When I look at this paragraph, two passages stand out. The first one reads, Mrs. Manstey rose once or twice and looked out of the window, but of the view nothing was discernible save a tardy light or two in the opposite windows. These lights at last went out, and Mrs. Manstey, who had watched for their extinction, began to dress herself. She actually stayed up and watched Mrs. Black's window. She was waiting for the people to go to sleep so that she could burn the place down without getting caught. This is crazy. The next part that stands out reads, Then she opened her closet and cautiously took out the kettle of kerosene, having slipped a bundle of wooden matches into her pocket. The act of taking the kerosene and matches makes this premeditated. She knows what she's doing. Again, this is a crazy solution to solving her problem. So, what message is the author making? I think the scene points to the idea of determinism, which should not be confused with determination. Determinism is the idea that outside forces control our lives so that freedom of choice is only an illusion. In previous lessons, we focused on Mrs. Manstey's character, and we identified her as a delusional or crazy person because she considered the plants, birds, and people who did not interact with her as her friends. Then, in this last passage, we see her acting crazy by actually going through with the arson. Well, being physically crazy or delusional is considered mental instability, and many people would agree that mental instability is a hereditary factor. In other words, the mental instability was passed down to her through her parents. She had no control over this. In other lessons, we focused on the differences between Mrs. Manstey and Mrs. Black's perspectives, and then on what Wharton was trying to tell us by contrasting the images of the yards. In both lessons, we arrived at the idea that social classes played a huge role in the story. Mrs. Black is from the upper class and Mrs. Manstey from the lower class. Mrs. Manstey offered Mrs. Black $2,000 to stop the construction, but let's face it, $2,000 isn't that much when you take into account that with the addition, Mrs. Black will be able to make way more money with the new renters. Money talks, and Mrs. Manstey would not have enough money to ever stop the construction. The constant social class struggle is the external force that drives her to do what she does. Both the heredity and external force controlled her behavior. She had no choice but to burn the balcony in hopes of stopping the construction that had already begun. So the thematic word of determinism works very well for this story. And the theme statement that could be used would be the illusion of control. Now remember, in the beginning of this lesson, we addressed two parts, how the character changes and how the main character affects others. Well, we've just identified that her change was uncontrollable due to the theme of the illusion of control. But we also said that her action did not affect Mrs. Black's decision to build the extension. I think the message here is that one person cannot make a difference. I know this is a harsh message to deliver, but let's remember, in Mrs. Manstey's delusional state at the end of her life, she is taken to the window so she can hear that there is no construction. In fact, it is at that point that she dies, believing that her crazy actions made a difference. But immediately following Mrs. Manstey's death, the construction resumes. So her one act really didn't make a difference. These two themes work together to produce a complex account of a story that otherwise has very little action. Now that we've identified the theme, we can dive even deeper into the text to understand how and why authors make certain choices in their writing, like how figurative language can impact a theme, or why an author structures a text in a specific manner. So when you're trying to find one theme or multiple themes within any text, you can use these 3 steps to help you. First, identify the conflict in the text. Then ask, how does the conflict cause the main character to change or affect other characters? And third, ask, what message does the author develop over the course of the text through this conflict? In this lesson, you have learned how to identify the development of theme by analyzing conflict.